أهلا وسهلا بك في قناة أستاذ عمار. أنا عمار غالب. هذه هي الحلقة السادسة من كورس تعلم القواعد الخاص بالمستوى المتوسط. بهذه الحلقة نتحدث عن past perfect simple، وهو الماضي التام البسيط، وبالتأكيد هناك اختبار في نهاية الفيديو. لا تنسى الاشتراك في القناة وتفعيل الجرس حتى تصلك كافة الفيديوهات بالتسلسل. خلينا نبدأ.
In this lesson we talk about the past perfect simple. بهذا الدرس نتحدث عن الماضي التام البسيط. Jane called me yesterday afternoon. Jane called me yesterday afternoon. This is past simple. هذا ماضي بسيط. Before Jane called me yesterday afternoon, Mike had arrived home. So we have first, Jane called me yesterday afternoon, and Mike had arrived home. So we have two actions in the past. لدينا حدثان في الماضي. The first one, الأول, الأقدم, Mike had arrived home. And the second one, والثاني, Jane called me yesterday afternoon. So the first one is past perfect simple. الأول هو ماضي تام بسيط. And the second one, past simple. والثاني ماضي بسيط. Together, سوية, we can say, Mike had arrived home before Jane called me yesterday afternoon. So, the first thing happened, أول شيء حدث هو Mike had arrived home, and then Jane called me yesterday afternoon. As you know, each tense has form, use, and time expressions. So we are going to start with the form of the past perfect simple. As you know, we have subject plus had plus past participle. Had here is an auxiliary verb, فعل مساعد, and the past participle is of the main verb, الفعل الرئيسي. So subject plus had plus past participle of the main verb. For example, my brother had arrived by noon. My brother had arrived by noon. وصل أخي قبل الظهر. By noon بمعنى before noon. My brother hadn't arrived by noon. This is negative. And had my brother arrived by noon? This is a question. We put the auxiliary at the beginning of the sentence. Had my brother arrived by noon? We also have short forms. لدينا أيضا صيغ قصيرة أو مختصرة. For example, he had come, he'd come. I had called, I'd called. This is usually in informal speaking and writing. هذا يستخدم عادة في الكتابة والكلام غير الرسمية. Use. Why do we use the past perfect simple? لماذا نستخدم الماضي التام البسيط? Number 1. To talk about an action that was completed before a specific time in the past. To talk about an action للتحدث عن فعل أو حدث that was completed انتهى ولكن متى before a specific time in the past قبل وقت محدد في الماضي. يعني قبل هذا الوقت انتهى شيء معين. For example, we have here 1 p.m. as you can see. 1 p.m. ساعة واحدة في الماضي. ساعة واحدة في الماضي. Before 1 p.m. قبل الساعة الواحدة we have Mike had arrived home by 1 p.m. Mike had arrived home by 1 p.m. So it means Mike had arrived home before 1 p.m. قبل الساعة الواحدة ظهرا. فحدث انتهى قبل وقت محدد في الماضي. قبل الواحدة ظهرا حدث شيء وهو Mike had arrived home. Number 2. To talk about an action that was completed before another action in the past. To talk about an action للتحدث عن شيء that was completed انتهى before another action in the past. قبل حدث آخر في الماضي. النقطة السابقة كان عندنا وقت، الآن عندنا حدث آخر، فعندنا حدثين بالماضي. For example, Jane called me yesterday afternoon. Jane called me yesterday afternoon. اتصلت بي جين عصر البارحة. قبل عصر البارحة ماذا حصل؟ حصل شيء آخر. هذا الشيء الآخر يكون ماضي تام بسيط، فهو ماضي قبل شيء آخر حدث في الماضي. So, Mike had arrived home. Mike had arrived home. Together سوية تصبح الجملة Mike had arrived home before Jane called me yesterday. Had arrived home. We can also say كان أيضا أن نقول when Jane called me yesterday afternoon, Mike had arrived home. When Jane called me yesterday afternoon, عندما اتصلت بي جين عصر البارحة, Mike had arrived home. كان مايك قد وصل بالفعل أو مسبقا أو قبل أن تتصل جين إلى المنزل. We can also say بالإمكان أيضا أن نقول by the time. By the time means when. تعني when عندما. By the time Jane called me yesterday afternoon, Mike had already arrived home. We have time expressions with the past perfect simple. لدينا تعابير زمنية مع الماضي التام البسيط. Number 1, we have after or as soon as. After and as soon as plus past perfect simple. يأتي بعدها ماضي تام بسيط. For example, after she had found a job, she moved out of her family house. After she had found a job, بعد أن وجدت وظيفة أو حصلت على وظيفة, she moved out of her family house. انتقلت من بيت عائلتها. As soon as we had arrived home, we went to bed. As soon as we had arrived home, we went to bed. حالما وصلنا للمنزل ذهبنا للفراش. فأولا وصلنا للمنزل وبعدها ذهبنا للفراش. Number 2, we have before, by the time, or when, plus past simple. Before, by the time, or when, plus past simple. For example, I hadn't been to Spain before you told me about it. I hadn't been to Spain. It means I hadn't visited. لم أزر Spain, إسبانيا, before you told me about it. قبل أن تخبرني عنها. إذن قبل أن تخبرني عنها أني لم أذهب إليها. By the time I called my sister, she had left the company. By the time I called my sister, عندما اتصلت بأختي, she had left the company. كانت أصلا غادرت الشركة. فإذا قبل اتصال بها هي غادرت. حدث شيء آخر. And we'd gotten out of home when we heard the blast outside. We'd gotten out of home. غادرنا المنزل أو خرجنا من المنزل. When we heard the blast outside. عندما سمعنا الانفجار خارجا. The last one is by. After by, you need a specific time. بعد كلمة by تحتاج وقت محدد. For example, my friend had finished his project by midday. Or you can say by 10 p.m. Now, test yourself. والآن اختبر نفسك. Complete with the past simple and the past perfect simple of the verbs in brackets. أمامك 30 ثانية لحل هذا التمرين. Now we look at the answers. والآن ننظر إلى الأجوبة. By the time Wendy got to the bus stop, the bus had left. Isabel had called me when the waiter took her order. Oliver and Fred really enjoyed the museum. They hadn't been there before. لا تنسى الاشتراك في القناة وتفعيل الجرس لتصلك كافة الفيديوهات بالتسلسل. شكرا جزيلا للمشاهدة.